Social house is a place where we can all come and be together as friends and be ourselves and just have fun. It's like the best part of the week.
It's a good place for me to make friends, reconnect with God, and just come together with all the people here.
Social house to me is like, when we moved here, it was like, we really didn't know what to do. We were just like lost. Like me personally, I was in like not a good spot over the summer because some stuff happened. And when we came here, it just felt like it was just like a family again. Cause like we came from something like this and we all just bonded together. And it's like a way to just talk about Jesus and get closer to him because people don't really talk about it and there's not really a spot to do it. And this is a spot where we can get closer and get with these people that share similar interests and get to know Jesus better.
Social house to me is probably getting together with friends to worship God.
To me, social house is more of like a family and just knowing that there's always people around you that care for you. Because when I first started coming here, which will be over a year in October, like the end of October, is when I really started to become happy because I've felt my relationship with Christ grow and I felt my relationship with like my peers grow more too. And it's sort of just like a way to bring light into God and then also into like your relationships with other people and grow those connections and be around people that are good for you and like want to see you grow, not only as a person, but also in your relationship with God.
To me, social house is just a place where we can invite new people that really want to learn about Christ. That's why sometimes we have the bashes and just for ourselves to learn more about God and come here. You know, we start off with a little bit of fun and fellowship, but then we go deep into his word just to learn more about him. Because, you know, like Matt was saying, in the end, it's all about following Jesus. It doesn't matter where you are right now, it matters where you end up.
Social house is more than just a social house. We want every teenager in Sarasota to encounter Jesus. We are committed to coming alongside the family to disciple this next generation as followers of Christ.
Well, good morning, church. My name is Shea Vossler, and I am the Next Generations pastor here at 360 Church. Some of y'all might be going, what is the social house? Like, I thought we were at 360. 360 students, we've branded that to be the social house, something that the students can hold on to, something that the students can take to school, something that the students can really be proud of. And so for the last 3 years, 360 Student Ministry has been the social house. I want to start off today with a little fun. So I'm going to throw up some pictures on the screen. And I'm going to, when I throw those pictures up on the screen, I'm going to ask a couple questions about them. You may recognize it, you may not. But let's go ahead and throw that first picture up on the screen. So, you know where I'm going with this. There are 3 pictures on the screen. They all represent TV shows, kind of. We'll get to that kind of in a second. If you know which the first one is on the left, raise your hand. Nice. If you don't, raise your hand. Yeah. Anybody want to yell it out? It's the Dick Van Dyke Show. That's right. All right, so the middle one. We should be able to meet in the middle with this one, right? The middle one. If you know what that is, raise your hand. Nice. If you don't, raise your hand. See where I'm going with this? Anybody want to yell it out? Dallas. The last one on the right. If you know what this last one on the right is, raise your hand. If you don't, raise your hand. Yeah. Students, who is that? Mr. Beast. So, funny thing, I said TV show, kind of. Throughout the generations, we've been watching TV. We've been watching Dallas. Who shot, what's his name? Yeah, Who Shot JR? Dick Van Dyke Show. I remember the Dick Van Dyke Show, not when it was originally on, but he's funny. I love laughing, so I used to watch Dick Van Dyke. Those are TV shows. Students today are watching YouTube. And YouTube, one of the biggest stars on YouTube is Mr. Beast. Don't know why he calls himself that. But he's funny. He does some really cool stuff. He gives away a ton of money to people. It's just a really cool show. This next one might spark a little emotion in you, because we know TV shows spark emotion, but music? How many of you know who the guy on the left is? You do? There you go. And those of you that don't, raise your hand. That's Johnny Cash right there. How many, now again, meet in the middle, right? How many of you know who the woman in the middle is? Oh, wow. How many of you don't? Students, anybody know? It is Whitney Houston. All right, this is a fun one. How many of you know the one on the right? Okay, there's some hip parents back here. How many don't? Who is it? That's Harry Styles right there. So we did TV, we did music. Let's do technology. Students, how many of you, this one on the left, students, this was technology at its prime, right here. If you didn't have those two things, you were in trouble. Anybody sitting in these first three rows be able to tell me what those two things, how they work together?
A tape recorder, and it helps whenever it got stuck.
It helped what?
Whenever it got stuck.
Whenever it gets stuck. She's close. She's got a tape recorder. It's a tape. Students, when the tape comes out of that, right? Your car eats it or something. Your tape deck, your what is that, boom box? You be jamming, right? All of a sudden, and this thing is eating all this tape up. You take that pencil and you just do this to it, right? It may take an hour. Depends on how long you got in there. And it's actually not even the right pencil. I kind of laughed at that. It would just, yeah. Adults, how many of you know what that thing on the right is? Oh, okay. Like 5 of you. Students, do you know what that is? Okay, what is it, students? It is the controllers to the virtual reality. I can't even say it. So have you guys, I know you guys have seen this, and you guys are probably like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen in the world. This whole thing you put on your face, right? And it completely blacks out. It is, you also hold those two controllers, and it's virtual reality. That's where we're going. You talk about, I was doing some research looking at virtual reality. They are selling land in virtual reality right now for crazy amounts of money. You're looking at Starbucks is buying it. You're looking at, it's where we're going. It is where, it's crazy. It's where we're going. All right, last one. This should be good. I titled this Everyday Use for a reason. Any student know what the thing on the left is? Okay. It's a washboard, right? Yeah. Now, what do you use a washboard for? I thought y'all were going to say making music. Yeah, that's right. That's some good music right there. How many adults know what the thing on the right is? So let me tell you about this thing on the right. This came out, and it was like the end of the world when this came out for parents. This is called Snapchat, right? Snapchat, the reason I put it in everyday use, because 99% of the communications that these students do with each other is through Snapchat. I would say that if it is great, there is no just text them, just call. There's definitely not call them. They will snap each other, and that's how they communicate. Now, the reason it was such an uproar when it first came out is because it could be dangerous. But it ultimately has a use that these students use every day just to communicate back and forth to each other. All right? We need each other. Generationally, I did so much research on generations the past couple of weeks preparing for this, the past month preparing for this. And I realized that when you go through generation to generation to generation, we have a tendency to look back and be like, I was talking to my wife's grandparents, born in the 30s, and they were saying, man, we had to work so hard. It was just out of the Depression. It was a different generation. It's called the silent generation. They had to work so hard for what they had. And they look down, they're like, nobody works. Everybody's lazy. Okay, that's a big blanket. But the fact is, they couldn't exist in today's world without the help of the generations that are in front of them. It would be hard. They have actually talked about moving to Kansas in the middle of nowhere because it's just easier, right? We need each other. The Bible puts it like this. Psalm 145, 4-7. One generation commends your work to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of glorious splendor of your majesty. And I will meditate on your wonderful works. They tell of the power of your awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. See, the psalmist was writing here talking about how one generation needs to commend God's work, needs to remind the next generation of what God has done, what he's doing, so that the next generation can be prepared and know how God moves and when he moves. Each generation is either invested in or is not. I titled today Investment because I believe God has said some critical things about how we as a group called Christians are called to invest in each other. Matthew 6:19-21 says this: do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, or where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there are also your heart will be. If you've been a Christian for any amount of time, you've probably heard that verse. But how often do you go, okay, store up treasures in heaven? How? Like, what does that mean? How does that work? And so Jesus was sitting with his disciples one day, and he was telling them a parable. And basically, at the end of this parable, he says this in Luke 16:9. I tell you, when he's talking to the disciples, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. All right, so Jesus is telling the disciples to buy friends. Join a sorority. Join a fraternity. No, I'm not. If you are in a sorority or fraternity or join one, that's fine. I'm not saying you bought your friends. But in other words, Jesus is telling the disciples, you should sacrifice your money to bring others to faith in Jesus and so secure a warm reception into heaven. When we talk about investment, we talk about a lot of the time bad investment. We talk about a lot of times we think of money. I've made some pretty bad house purchases in 2008, right? Didn't know that was going to happen. It was a bad investment. I lost my shirt on that. But Christ is telling us to invest well. So much so that he's telling you the money that you have, invest that in people. Invest that into the kingdom. Invest that into eternity. And when you think about investing into people, the first thing that came to my mind was, discipleship. Right? We talk a lot about discipleship here. We talk about small circle and exchange and one-to-one discipleship. It is a core of what this church is and how we believe that Christ has called us to go make disciples. And when we look at disciples in the Bible, we think of, obviously, a couple. We think of Barnabas and Paul. In Acts 11, 25 through 26, Barnabas says, it says, then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. Barnabas went to Antioch to go see a guy named Saul. The disciples were in Jerusalem, and they were sitting there going, what is happening down there? Like, there's apparently, everybody knew who Saul was. He was killing Christians. He was putting them in jail. He was doing terrible things. And then all of a sudden, there's a conversion. So Barnabas went, and Barnabas was like, this dude's real. Like, he is filled with the Spirit. And so Barnabas decided that he was at risk, was going to take this guy under his wing and disciple him. Initially spending a whole year in one place, just building a relationship. From there, you look at Paul and Timothy. So Paul took what he learned from Barnabas and went to Timothy. Paul and Timothy's relationship lasted 20 years. The age difference between the two was somewhere around 30 years of age difference. 30-year age difference. When you're looking, okay, God, who do you want me to invest in? Who do you want me to pour into? It could be someone 30 years younger than you. It could be someone 5 years younger than you. I don't know. God put these people in your life for a purpose. But recognize that when you look at Paul and Timothy, they spent 20 years together. That is a huge investment. The next one I would say is Moses and Joshua. Moses pulled all the Israelites out of Egypt. Well, God pulled all the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses did what God told him to do. But Moses brought up a guy named Joshua, who ultimately took the Israelites into the promised land. That relationship was 40 plus years. They spent a long time together. When you're talking about investing in a relationship, when you're talking about investing in a discipleship, it's not quick. Your ROI does not happen tomorrow. We are starting to become a generation of like, I want to see some fruit come out of this thing. And a lot of the times, coming from the student pastor, you don't see fruit. The Bible calls it planting a seed. When you look at another relationship, you look at Barnabas and Mark. Now, if you know anything about Barnabas and John Mark and Paul, you know that there was a huge split between the two of them. Because at the time, John Mark was just a helper. And he was traveling with Barnabas and Paul on their missionary journeys. And it came to a point where we don't know if he got scared, John Mark. We don't know if so Paul was starting to preach the gospel to Gentiles, and we don't know if John Mark was like, nope, we're not doing that. And he ran home and told all the disciples in Jerusalem. But all we know is from one text in Acts to another, Barnabas is like, hey, on the second journey, let's take John Mark. And Paul's like, nope, that guy's not going with us. He's not coming. And Barnabas is like, what? We've been investing in this guy. Like, he is someone I've poured into just like I poured into you. And Mark's like, nope. Ultimately, years passed between Barnabas and Paul, and they didn't talk. But Barnabas still believed in John Mark, just like he believed in Paul. And ultimately, if you know the end of the story, you know that John Mark is also Mark of the Gospel of Mark. He wrote the Gospel of Mark. Outside the Bible, who knows the name Albert McCacken? None of you. That's right. Albert McCacken was a farmhand. He was working on a family farm in the 1930s. And he started befriending this teenage owner's son. And ultimately, there was a revival happening. Back in the day, students, they did this thing called revival. We'll talk about that later. There was a revival happening. It was 3 days. So Albert McCacken went to this 16-year-old boy and said, hey, why don't you come to this revival with me? On the third day, that 16-year-old boy accepted Christ. Later on, tried to get into a student ministry. This is one of the funniest parts of this. Tried to get into a student ministry. Back then, you had to become a member of the student ministry. I'm thinking of bringing that back. You had to be a member of the student ministry. But they wouldn't let him in because they said he was too worldly. That 16-year-old boy was Billy Graham. Albert McCacken, nobody knows his name, but he made an investment. Let's do another one. Edward Kimball. Edward Kimball was a Sunday school teacher. And God put it on Edward Kimball's heart, this student he used to have, this kid that he used to have. At this point, the kid was 18 years old, and he was working at his uncle's boot factory in Boston. Well, God put it on Edward's heart. He's like, I've got to go share the good news with this 18-year-old. If he doesn't know now, he's got to know now. Like, he was dead set on making sure that 18-year-old knew who Jesus was. It says this: after praying about the matter, he arranged to visit him in the boot store. He said, I was determined. He said, I was determined to speak to him about Christ and about his soul, and started down to Holton's boot store. I found him in the back, and he was just wrapping up boots. I went to him once and put my hand on his shoulder, and I made what felt like a very weak plea for Christ. I don't know just what words I used. I simply just told him Christ's love for him and the love Christ wanted in return. That was all there was. It seemed like the young man was just ready for the light that then broke upon him. And there, back in that store in Boston, D.L. Moody gave himself and his life to Christ. Edward Kimball. Nobody knows that name. But he sure did make an investment that ultimately changed Christianity in the world as we know it in this modern day with Billy Graham and D.L. Moody. One last one. David Swaim. Anybody know that name? David Swaim was at the College of William and Mary in 1995. And as he was going through college, he decided to take a youth pastor's job in Williamsburg, Virginia. Now, David came from a family of incredibly intelligent and educated people. All of his four brothers, I think there were four, all of his four brothers went to Harvard for their undergrad. David was the black sheep because he went to William and Mary. Well, David was married at the time and just starting off his marriage, and decided to start a student ministry. And in that student ministry, well, not even in that student ministry, but there was a new kid who started coming to church. That student ministry was small, it was about 20 students. New kids started coming to church. And David was this quintessential, like, William and Mary guy, where he would have this pastel bow tie on and have this big old grin on his face. And he would walk up to that student and he'd go, hey, come to youth. And that student was like, nope, not doing that. And he just would not leave that student alone. Ultimately, the student ministry was taking a mission trip to Ecuador, and that student's mom looked over and did one of those mom at church kind of situations where the kid's sitting in church and like, oh, look, honey, we're going to Ecuador. Okay. That student was like, all right, why not? That started a relationship of 4 years where Dave poured into that student. That student who came from a really tough background. That student parents had been married and divorced 4 times. That student had lived in 9 different states, moved 4 different high schools and 4 different middle schools. That student had a rough go from 19 before that. But because David Swain would not let go. That's why I'm here. And for the last 20 years, because David Swain decided to invest into this incredibly arrogant kid that just wouldn't hear the truth for anything because of the life that he had had prior, he didn't let go. And because of that, over the last 20 years, I've been able to pour into students. I've been able to pour my life into students. And it has been an incredible honor to be a part of all of these students' lives. But it would have never happened if Dave didn't answer God's call and decide to invest. It wasn't easy. Let me tell you, Dave investing into me was not easy. I thank God that I have yet to come across a student like me over the last 20 years. And I don't want to curse it either. But more seriously, we talk about discipleship. We look at those people in the Bible. We look at Edward Kimball, or we look at David Swain. And that's discipleship. But even more core, even just more basic, you just talk about relationship. One of Pastor Steve's favorite verses, I called him up this week and just said, what is your go-to like relationship, discipleship verses that you use? He listed like 20 of them. I was like, okay, I'll pick one. But I think this is perfect. 1 Samuel 18:1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, this is Jonathan, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now that's a relationship. But we know if you read through 1 Samuel, that relationship was not easy. It comes down to how we love each other. The Bible says a lot about that. I'm going to flip through some verses just to show you what the Bible says about it. Mark 12, 38 through 41 says, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating, noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer. He asked, of all of the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. John 13, 34, 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have loved one another. 1 Peter 4, 7 through 10. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be clear-minded and self-controlled that you can pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because the love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. 1 Corinthians 13. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now, I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. 1 John 2:15. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of a sinful man, the lust of his eyes, the boasting of what he has or does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. Last one, John 3:16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. I think it's pretty clear. And I could go on and on and on and on and on about what the Bible says about love. But if we're honest with each other, love is hard. Love on earth in this world not only is hard, it can even be a source of pain. Am I right? Jonathan Edwards, a pastor, he preached a sermon once called "Heaven is a World of Love." We were meant for the kind of love that we'll experience in the kingdom of heaven, not for the kind of love that we have here on earth. Heaven is a world of love. So Jesus tells us to invest into the future, invest in relationships, because they have the ability to last forever. So in this sermon, he writes 5 barriers of being able to love and be loved in this world. And these 5 barriers are this: we all want to be loved for our own sake. It's painful when we find that others sometimes love us for what they can get out of a relationship with us. We want to express our love without impediment. Often here on earth, pride, selfishness, defensiveness get in the way. Even the people we love the best, we don't love well. But in heaven, we will. We want to love mutually. There's no greater pain than loving someone who doesn't love you back. But in heaven, we will. When you love someone, you can't stand when they're not happy. If you're not happy, if they're not happy, you can't be happy. It said that you'll never be happier than your unhappiest child. But in heaven, we will all infinitely be happy. We want to love without parting. We don't ever want to separate. But that happens constantly here on earth. It will not in heaven. You see, the thing is, we are in this world, but we're not of this world. If you call yourself a believer, if you call yourself a Christian, we're meant for something greater. And God gave us a capacity to love as we will love in heaven. We are in a fallen world trying to use that heavenly love with sin involved. And that's hard sometimes. But it doesn't mean you can stop. It doesn't mean you can look at a possible investment for the future and go, I don't know if I can because I've just been too hurt. God's not concerned about what's happening, how you feel here on earth, because he knows that'll ultimately be resolved once you get to heaven. He's calling you to know it's going to hurt. He says you will suffer here, but continue on. And he says, just know I am Jesus. I've overcome the world. Guys, I want to jump back to Luke 16:9. Read it just one more time. Jesus talking to his disciples. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwelling. Y'all, people, the people sitting next to you, the people in front of you, the people behind you, those relationships, that discipleship, that's forever. And as a generation looks down at another generation, or a generation past that generation looks down on the previous generation, we do not good for each other. The fact is, we need each other. I always used to say, when generations would look down on my students' generation, I'd be like, well, you raised them. People, relationships, love is forever. So I don't want you to leave here without some tools. And the tools I kind of threw into a who, what, when. The who. Who do I invest in, Shea? Henry Blackaby wrote a book called Experiencing God, and Dave Swaim actually, when I ultimately made the decision to genuinely, honestly follow Christ, brought that book up, and we walked through it that next year. In that book, Henry Blackaby says, you don't have to be inventive or creative to follow Jesus. You don't have to be inventive or creative to do something for Christ. Henry Blackaby says, Christ is at work all around you. Just look around. And whatever you see people serving or doing what they're doing for the name or sake of Christ, just go join them. Guys, there's stuff that's happening throughout the church constantly. Go join them. Get involved. Plug in. Is Mr. Goff here today? Do you guys know Mr. Goff? Probably second service. Mr. Goff, he just celebrated his birthday. Does anybody know? 93 years old. Mr. Goff shows up almost every Wednesday night and just hangs out with these students. It is the coolest thing I've ever seen. He comes in, he's not preoccupied or worried about what do they think, what are they thinking of me? He just wants to hang out with them. And he always comes up to me, he's like, Shea, what can I do? And I'm like, I'm not really sure. Like, could you take, nope, you can't take the trash out. But seriously, just invest. And you can see him sitting and talking to a student. But it's the neatest thing. It's one of the coolest things I've had as a student pastor over the last 20 years, to have a 93-year-old not be intimidated by these youngins and be able to come in and just pour into them. Who? Look where God is working. Go join him. What? There are different things you can do when it comes to relationship or when it comes to investing into someone else. The obvious one is small circle. The obvious one we have is called exchange. It's one-to-one discipleship. I have a one-to-one discipleship partner. Mr. Steve Crump has come alongside me and been able to, it's funny because you've been in the pastoral business for 20 years, like, okay, I need a disciple. Yes, you need a disciple, Shea. He's come in and it's just been the greatest relationship. We are almost finished walking through our one-to-one discipleship exchange tool, but that relationship will be forever. I can't tell you how much I appreciate him. So that's happening constantly throughout the week here in this church. Connect groups happen every other week. And if you don't know, the reason connect groups happen every other week is so that you utilize your one-to-one discipleship the week that's on the off week of the connect group. Because we don't want to be the church that just has thousands of things scheduled for you. But these we feel are important. It doesn't even have to happen here. But you can serve. You can go give your time and energy somewhere. I have tons of young adults and adults that serve these students. You can go serve in a ministry outside these four walls. There's all kinds of ministries happening here in Sarasota. Go serve. Look where God is working and go join him. And if you can't serve, if you're not able to serve, you can support. We have tons of people that give us support so that these students can go to camp every year because the prices are insane. And so we have people come to, and it's not something I've created. They just come to me, hey, can I sponsor a kid to go to camp? Absolutely. We took over 30 kids to camp last year. Of those kids that went to camp, we probably sponsored 10 of them totally, which is a big, huge help. These kids wouldn't have that experience otherwise. Okay, the win. You don't have to add when you do stuff. You shouldn't have to create something new to put on your schedule. Right? Your schedule is already packed. God's not saying, go start something else, do something else, add that to the schedule you already have. And this is something I try to tell anybody, if I can get their ear, is that if God's working already around you, that means you're already in relationships with people that God wants you to be more intentional with. God's already set it up. All you have to do is just be intentional with it. So you're not adding more time to your crazy schedule. You're just being more intentional with the time that you have within that schedule. So when? It already exists. It's already there. Just be more intentional with it. Who, what, where, when. I want to close by a quote with Jim Elliot. If you don't know Jim Elliot, he was murdered, actually, in the midst of his missionary work down in South Central America. I think it was South and Central America. He says this, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. I'm going to read it again. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. Guys, people are forever. Relationships are forever. My experience over the last 20 years investing in the young adults, investing in the students, I wouldn't trade for the world. There are many times where I said, nope, never doing this again, because it is hard. These students are real. They live real lives, and some of these lives aren't easy. And so it gets messy. And I promise you, if you get into a relationship, if you get into an intentional relationship, if you get into discipleship, God's called us to be authentic. God's called us to be who we are. And that's going to get messy. It's okay, because those investments are eternal. Things don't have to come easy for them to be amazing. Typically, the harder things are the things that you hold on to the greatest. Invest into people. This isn't a student takeover where I'm saying, look, I want to see all of you at the volunteer table later, and I want all of you to be volunteering by next week. No, I don't want you all to volunteer. But God wants you to go and invest into people. God wants you to go and pour into people. And students, the same thing. My favorite thing about students is that God's placed them in the largest mission field in America, the public school system. I always tell them, I can't go there, because if I go there and I sit down at a lunch table and start talking to people, I'm the creepiest guy around. But God's given them the opportunity to build relationships with people. To build relationships with people that don't know who Jesus are on the largest mission field in America. People always ask, why do we do these bashes? We do a bash like once every other month. And we don't do anything but have fun. Because I wanted to create a place here at 360. I wanted to create a place for these students to be able to bring those friends that they're building relationships with and introduce them to church. And have them recognize, oh, this isn't weird. I thought I was going to get beat over the head with a Bible. I thought it was going to be a revival. No. I thought it was going to be different. But y'all are pretty cool. And so from there, that introduction's made between them and me, between them and this church, between them and God. And then from there, they go into a medium-sized circle, which we call the social house on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings. And that's where we dig into the Bible. And then from there, in our student ministry, we are now starting what we're calling home groups, which are actually groups dedicated. We have leaders, adult leaders, that are in a home discipling these kids. It's like a 1-to-5 ratio. And we're hoping that God does some incredible work through that. God's called you to invest. He's already working around you. Just take a look. See what he's doing. See where he's doing it.